Othello, the Moore of Venice by William Shakespeare. Shakespeare is probably the first of our authors who needs no introduction, or at least not much of one. He's one of the, or probably the most famous author in the English language, and somebody we feel like we know a lot about because it's somebody we've heard about since we were kids, probably since before we ever came close to reading any Shakespeare plays or seeing any adaptations in film or on the screen of Shakespeare plays. But if you remember way back to Unit 3, I introduced the illusion of knowledge. We tend to assume we know a lot about something that we hear about a lot, or something that's familiar to us, even if we can't list that many details. Well, William Shakespeare is one of those people about whom we culturally have an illusion of knowledge. He's somebody whose work we know very well, and who had a reputation among the people who knew him. They esteemed him very highly. That included other authors of the time like Ben Jonson and Christopher Marlowe, but it also included the Queen of England. However, however much they esteemed him, however good, valuable his reputation was, we don't actually know much in detail about him. We know he was someone of great quality, but we don't know a large quantity of information about his life. Where he was for large amounts of his life when he had left Stratford-upon-Avon, where he was born, before he ended up on the London stage, before he became one of the King's Men or the King's Company of a theater troupe, or when before he opened his own theater, the Globe Theater in London. There are large amounts of his life that are missing, what we might think are important details about his life missing. We don't even really know what he looked like. These pictures here look familiar enough. Maybe the one in the center seems new. That's because it is new. It was only discovered about 10 years ago. It's referred to as the Cobb portrait, and we're not even exactly 100% sure that it's Shakespeare. But then again, we're not sure that the picture on the far right is Shakespeare either. It's probably one of the most famous ones. These two images are the only ones made in his lifetime, if they are Shakespeare. They're the only ones made while he was alive, the only portraits for which he could have sat and modeled for the artist. And if you look at them, they look like they could be two different people. The familiar engraving that was published in the 1623 folio edition of Shakespeare's work was probably based on the picture on the right. But that folio was published several years after Shakespeare's death, so it could have been drawn from memory from someone who knew him, but it wasn't actually made during his lifetime. And the image at the bottom left is his funerary monument, which obviously was most likely made after he died, after he was buried there. We don't know exactly what his signature looked like. There are several signatures that can be verified. They're on legal documents that would have had to have been signed by Shakespeare, but they don't really look alike. And we don't know exactly how he spelled his name. He would always abbreviate it in one form or another. Like sometimes he would just write out Willm Shakp, and just to stand for William Shakespeare. Or he would spell Shakespeare Shakspere or Shakspee or Shakspare. He never, however, spells it the way we spell it, which is Shakespere. And this lack of information about somebody about whom we feel like there should be more information has led a lot of speculation, has led to some conspiracy theories about maybe Shakespeare wasn't really Shakespeare. Maybe, especially if you look at the depth of knowledge and the deep understanding of the human character, as well as the culture at the time, the sort of international awareness that these plays contain. A lot of people have said this couldn't be the work of a commoner. This couldn't be the work of the son of a glove maker. John Shakespeare, William Shakespeare's father, made gloves for a living. He was relatively wealthy because, just because this trade doesn't sound like one that would be very high ranking. It was a very necessary trade, and his family was prominent enough to get their own coat of arms. So even though we can use that phrase, say that he's a glove maker, and that might make him seem an unlikely success, he had at least enough cultural capital and financial capital to get to the part of London where he was able to really appropriate the knowledge, the sort of wisdom, the knowledge about the world and the cultural capital of the people around him. But still, there are these sort of conspiracy theories that his plays would have had to have been written by somebody more famous, somebody about whom we know more, somebody like Christopher Marlowe or Francis Bacon, one of the founders of the modern scientific theory and a very famous philosopher about whom a lot is written. Or it could have been the Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere. All of these theories sort of presume that the son of a glove maker couldn't have been that intelligent, couldn't have been that well educated. And that should sound kind of disappointing. I mean, 3 or 4 centuries after El Cid really brought up this question, are nobles really that much better than everybody else? I don't think so. I think commoners have just as much, at least the possibility of sort of outshining other people on the battlefield in personal virtue and moral courage, but also clearly in artistic ability and education. But there's still that recurring doubt that somebody from such humble beginnings could have shown the sort of, to sound cliche, the sort of artistic genius that Shakespeare showed. These conspiracy theories are really unnecessary and unjustified because all he really needed was the ability to read and access to books. And that's something that somebody at his status definitely had. We can actually trace a lot of the stories themselves. Remember the difference between a story and a narrative. And, if we call Shakespeare's plays narratives, technically, they don't have a narrator, but they are particular representations of a story, and stories could be told lots of different ways. Well, these stories have their own histories. For instance, Hamlet ultimately comes from the work, The History of the Danes, or Gesta Danorum, by the medieval Danish chronicler Saxo Grammaticus. He tells a story about a guy named Hamlet, and sometimes it's translated as Amloth, who speaks in riddles and is trying to find a way to avenge his father on his uncle because his uncle murdered his father to become king, and he's being very closely guarded because he's the real heir, and he has to pretend to be crazy, to pretend to be insane so that he can be sure that it's his uncle that committed the murder and then escape being killed himself long enough to get his revenge. Well, this story is the kernel for Hamlet. King Lear is described in Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain. There's a very common, at this time, in Shakespeare's Elizabethan England, there's a work of history called Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland, written by the historian Raphael Holinshed. And this contains not just the sort of general histories of people like Macbeth and Richard III and Henry V, but specific incidents that are described in Shakespeare's play, incidents that wouldn't necessarily be that relevant to history, but make good stories and, as such, get adapted into these plays. Romeo and Juliet has elements that come from Ovid's Metamorphosis, the Latin writer Ovid, as well as Salernitano's Marietta and Gianosa. And then Geoffrey Chaucer, I mentioned his work Troilus and Cressade, where Shakespeare tells essentially the same story with some alterations, and I would call them improvements, in his play Troilus and Cressida. And some people have looked at this and said, oh, I'm disappointed to find out that Shakespeare actually stole his stories, quote unquote, from all these other authors or these other traditions. Because keep in mind, these authors, people like Saxo Grammaticus, was writing down stories that had been in the oral tradition for generations, perhaps centuries before him. So some people are sometimes disappointed that Shakespeare had sources. But the narratives that he creates, and narratives not specifically with narrators, but narratives that are acted out, that are performed. These narratives that he generates are very unique, and they say something that is not in the source materials. He has a lot of artistic control, and he very much comments on issues that were relevant to his day that may not have been relevant when these works were first introduced into print. And that's definitely true with the work that I asked you to read, with his Othello. Othello clearly owes its story shape to a work called the Hecatomythi by Giovanni Battista Giraldi Cinthio, or Cinthio. And Cinthio, I'm going to anglicize this, Cinthio, has at least 2 stories that Shakespeare adapted into plays for the stage. One is the story of Apicia, and that was adapted into his 1603 play Measure for Measure. But then Othello clearly corresponds to Un Capitano Moro, or the Moorish captain. Although the Moorish captain is not named Othello, or if he is, we don't know it. He doesn't have a name at all. He is married to a woman named Desdemona. He has an ensign who's not named Iago. He's not named. The ensign has a wife who corresponds to Amelia, but again, not named. And there's a corporal who corresponds to Cassio, but again, not named. And these characters are very recognizable as the characters in Othello, but they're not nearly as well developed. They don't have the dimension. It is a very short story. There's not enough time to really get into these characters' inner lives. So we have them sort of described. The Moorish captain is a gallant man, and Desdemona is a virtuous lady. And the ensign, who corresponds to Iago, is handsome but of scoundrelly nature. There's not enough sort of development of these characters. We have to recognize the type of character in order to really understand their motivations. This is not going to be the case in the play Othello. And I want to remind you of the sort of stages of iteration that we discussed all the way back when we first began the class and talked about the story of Atrahasis and how that eventually, or at least part of it, found its way into the Epic of Gilgamesh. Each time a narrative is rewritten, or in this case performed, is an iteration. Each iteration borrows some or adapts some story elements but leaves other story elements out. Sometimes those story elements are incompatible. Sometimes those story elements, there's just too many of them for the form of the particular narrative. So the story is multiform. It has all of these different potential things that any given author or performer can include, but there's going to be more things than any author or performer can include. You can't put them all into any one iteration. So the story is always multiform. It always has these different forms. You're never going to trace them all the way back to a single original. Even in modern traditions, the modern sort of idea of the author, if you go back and ask any author who's written a very clear first edition that's very clearly his or hers, she'll tell you that, oh, well, I had all these different ideas and it changed so many times during the writing, and I still want to go back and revise it now that it's published because there's so many things I want to do different. So even when a work comes from a single author, they'll always say that there were different versions during the writing process and they had influences. They borrowed elements from other works. That's going to be even more true in a play, and I mentioned this a little bit when we talked about Aeschylus and Prometheus Bound, but with Othello we have a very clear example, because anytime you see the play performed, you're going to see not just this one script performed the way Shakespeare wanted it performed, because a lot of times they're going to be very clear artistic licenses taken. Back in the 90s, the movie O, starring Mekhi Phifer, Josh Hartnett, and Julia Stiles, adapted the Othello story to like a high school basketball team. Clearly that's taken a lot of creative license and it's noticeable, but even if somebody tried to perform Othello on stage and tried to read every single word of the script exactly the way that it came down to us from Shakespeare or the printed versions of Shakespeare, they still have to make a lot of different interpretations about how to act out a particular line, which lines to enunciate, what you're doing with your body while you're saying these lines, because Shakespeare gives very, very, very little stage direction, if any. Usually it's just that this character walks on the stage and this character walks off the stage. So the text of the play isn't the play itself. Every performance of a play is a different iteration, and it requires different interpretive decisions by the director, the actors, even the stage crew. Sometimes these decisions have to be made in the middle of a performance because an actor forgot his line or a stage machine malfunctions. And there has to be an impromptu decision about how to compensate for that without breaking character, without breaking the fourth wall, without interrupting the audience's experience of continuity in time within the play. And so that makes each particular performance unique. Even if it's the same troupe performing the same lines, following the same basic stage direction, it's still, each performance is going to be unique. And sometimes the mistakes and the improvisations make for a better performance. And sometimes the interpretive decisions make the performance seem like a different story altogether. And even beyond the performance itself, the text of Shakespeare, we can't look to one original first edition just Shakespeare. we don't want to think of the written script as an text. The text which is like the genuine original and against which all later versions have to be judged. In Shakespeare's case, that's not even an option. We don't have any versions of his plays that were written by Shakespeare himself in his own hand. All of the printed plays come from editions that were published after his death, and these earliest editions contain differences between them. The first performance of Shakespeare's Othello probably happened at the Globe Theatre in either 1601 or 1602. But our earliest printed editions of the play were produced nearly 20 years later in the first quarto as well as the first folio. Those names, the quarto and folio, come from the way that each of these books was printed. The first quarto was the oldest. It was printed in 1622, a good 6 years after Shakespeare had died. And it's called the quarto because the pages would be printed out on this large page, and that page would be folded on both sides of this page, and that page would be folded in half, and then that half would be folded again, and then it would be bound into the book, and then the copyist would cut along that seam. So a lot of times if you see a very old book, that's why even if you look at books that were printed in the 20th century, a lot of times you'll see really rough pages, especially on the side and bottom, maybe not the top. The top is usually a little smoother looking. That's because at some point they would print them out like this and they would still be folded after they were bound. Somebody would have to cut along the edge to open it up. Now the folio would look a lot nicer because, as you see this diagram on the bottom, it would just be, have sort of 4 pages, and it would be folded, and then those would be folded within each other, but you wouldn't have to cut any of those pages. So as similar as these two editions are, as the plays are in each one of these, there are minor differences, and those minor differences will add up. This is one of the reasons why if you have the Ardent Shakespeare Othello, which I recommend for this class, you follow along with it and you try to use it to follow along or try to match it with the Bodleian Library or the Folger Library printed editions of Shakespeare's Othello, which I gave you links to. You'll see that after a while the lines don't match up anymore. And in some plays we have entire scenes that they're missing from one edition and not the other, even though these were printed just a year apart. On the first lines of Othello, they're pretty much the same, except there's this phrase "splud" when Iago's first lines reply to Rodrigo. Splud is left out of the second one. That might be because it was considered obscene. It's a shortened version of the sort of swearing, saying Christ's blood. Like if somebody, somebody just shouts Jesus Christ, we feel, some people are going to be offended because that's taking the Lord's name in vain. Well, making a reference to the blood Christ shed on the cross, that's a way of swearing at the time, and that's something that probably had to be taken out for due to the censorship laws that were becoming increasingly severe shortly after Shakespeare's lifetime. The world of Othello is a world a few decades before Shakespeare's time. Remember that I said when we discussed Geoffrey Chaucer that Chaucer was a medieval writer, but he was influenced by Giovanni Boccaccio, who was a Renaissance writer. But the Renaissance came after the Middle Ages, so how could somebody in the Middle Ages be influenced by somebody in the Renaissance? Well, that's because Italy began the Renaissance before that sort of rebirth of learning reached England. A few people in England who were very international, very cosmopolitan, they were sort of aware of what was going on with the Italian Renaissance early on, people like Chaucer. But it took a long time for that same sort of appreciation of classical literature, classical philosophy, and art, and that sort of thing to come back to England. Because Italy essentially gives birth to the Renaissance, it's a sort of cultural region that's very much looked up to by people like William Shakespeare. And so though Shakespeare and London at this time we are now in the Renaissance, even in England, is still looking to Italy as this more advanced place, this more highly cultured place. It seems to be one of the reasons why most of Shakespeare's plays are set in Italy. There are far more plays set in Italy than there are in England. In fact, pretty much only his history plays and maybe A Midsummer Night's Dream take place in England. But also keep in mind, Italy is not a nation state right now. It's not one consistent country. The Republic of Venice, Venice is a city still today, but at this time it's a republic. It has territory around the modern day area of the city of Venice, but it also has territory along the coast of modern day Croatia and Greece, and they also occupied the island of Cyprus, which is the island off the coast of Lebanon and Israel in the far eastern Mediterranean. They also occupy the island of Rhodes. And both of these islands are just off the coast of the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire is what used to be the Byzantine Empire. And the Byzantine Empire had been the Eastern Roman Empire before that. Well, this had been the sort of descendant of the Roman Empire, the Christian Byzantine Empire, up until 1453. Now remember, the Byzantine Empire had lost territory in North Africa, like Egypt. It had lost Israel and Syria and Lebanon to Arab Muslims who had invaded from the Arabian Peninsula a long time before this. But modern day Turkey remained Byzantium. It remained the Byzantine Empire. Anatolia remained part of the sort of European Christian Byzantine Empire until Istanbul, or Constantinople, fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, and Constantinople was renamed Istanbul. So the Ottoman Empire is, starting in the 1400s, is a new and threatening presence. It's a massive political power, but it's also a political power that holds a different religion. And we saw the antagonism between sort of Christian and Muslim empires in Al-Andalus in Spain, but we saw that those were sort of, at the local level, relatively tolerant. They were able to move back and forth between each other's kingdoms under certain circumstances. That's not the case in the Byzantine Empire or the Ottoman Empire. And the Republic of Venice is one of the European powers that is really fighting back the Ottomans. They're trying to hold on to those last territories of the Byzantine Empire, especially because the Venetians are traders. They're mariners who sail all over the Mediterranean and trade with various ports. So they're trying to hold on to their ports. They've got a really strong navy, and they're trying to consistently fight against the Turks. And this is why the references to the Turks are frequently just the singular, the Turk, in the play of Othello, are references to this completely alien form of life. Whereas, even though Othello is from Morocco, he's a Moor, he's still somebody who's described as Venetian. He's very civilized, but even he makes references to the Turks as this sort of almost non-human enemy. And the worst things that he can say about other people or say about himself is when he compares himself to a Turk. But this is Shakespeare sort of picking up the writing from Cinthio, and Cinthio, being an Italian, is very much carrying out the way people essentialize each other, essentialize their enemies, the way the Rattlers and the Eagles did in the Robbers Cave experiment. When you have these two cultures, these two imagined communities at war with each other, they tend to really denigrate each other. So Cinthio is writing the Hecatomythi, which contains the Moorish captain, in 1565, while after Venice has had control of the island of Cyprus, which before that had been an independent kingdom, but they've basically sort of taken over because they have the navy to protect Cyprus from Turkish occupation. And Cinthio's writing the Moorish captain story in 1565. And at this time, the Venetians had been relatively successful against the Turks. Now, shortly after that, just about 5 years after that, the Ottoman Turks would actually capture Cyprus, and they'd massacre every Venetian inhabitant who didn't escape. So that's one point of difference between Cinthio's time when he's writing the story initially and Shakespeare's time when he's 1601, 1602, a good 30 years after the Turks had retaken Cyprus. So by the time Shakespeare is writing Othello, it's very anachronistic. It's not clear to what extent Shakespeare actually knows how anachronistic it is, although there is some indication, some foreshadowing at the end that because of what has happened with Othello, because of the sort of fall of this great warrior, that now Cyprus is going to be vulnerable. But that takes some reading into the play. So we're already familiar with the connection between the sort of Muslim world, the interaction between the Muslim world and the European world during the time of El Cid, let's say. we have that sort of background knowledge, and we've seen people from Morocco before. We've seen that in Al-Andalus, this was a kingdom that was settled by the Berbers. Southern Spain was invaded by the Berbers coming across the Straits of Gibraltar from Morocco. But it's clear that Othello is not exactly based on the people, the majority of the population of North Africa, which were Berbers, which were very close in appearance and of course in religion to Arabs who had moved across North Africa from the Arabian Peninsula. But it's clear that Shakespeare and to some degree Cinthio, his source, are both making Othello not a North African, but a Sub-Saharan African, an African with much darker skin. We have to keep in mind that at this time in Europe, the word race and ideas about race are not what they are today. The slave trade, which has begun at this point, but has not really become a large industry yet, that's going to really shape the perception of incompatible differences between white Europeans and black Africans, as if those were two homogenous groups, and everyone within them was, somehow related to each other. Race is essentially an imagined community, and I've introduced this term before. We assume that someone who is white and of Irish descent has a lot in common with somebody who is white and of Polish descent. But keep in mind, even 100 years ago, people thought, the Polish are a completely different kind of people. They're described as a different race. And frankly, the Irish and the English consider themselves different races. Throughout English literature, the Irish are described as if they were almost a different species of people, and of course considered inferior. Despite the fact that we are indistinguishable today, like a large number of white Americans are both Anglo and Irish descent. The other peoples of Europe, people of Italian descent, Polish descent, Eastern European descent, were considered different races as recently as the beginning of the 20th century. So the ideas about what a Moor is are very vague and are still being constructed, still being identified. There's the essentialist notions that very clearly would develop in European and European American literature after this point have not quite solidified yet. So Othello is described as a Moor, but he's described as having the characteristics of a sub-Saharan African. He's described as a Berber, that is somebody from the Barbary coast, but keep in mind the Berbers, like the Moors, were closer related to Arabic North Africans. And it's not that the people in London at the time wouldn't have known this. There was an ambassador and his retinue coming from the nation of Morocco to Queen Elizabeth in 1600. And it's very likely that as a royal guest of the crown, he could have gone to Shakespeare's Globe Theatre and seen a production of any of the plays leading up to Othello, and conceivably could have seen Othello itself. But there's also a community of sub-Saharan Africans, Africans with very dark skin, very dark hair, people that are Central and Southern African, and they are living in London, and they're not slaves or former slaves or anything like that. That sort of institution has not really taken hold yet. These are sailors who have gotten on English ships at some point while the English were exploring and trading with sub-Saharan Africa. They would be hired on as hands on the ship, and they would end up where the ship ended up, which would frequently be in England, and they would find other Africans that were there and create this expatriate community. And they had been there since 1588, and they were there from 1588 until 1603, which is right after the play Othello is performed. And it's in 1603 that they're not exiled, but it seems that Queen Elizabeth let it be known that she invited them to leave, whatever that means. That seems like that they were still regarded, they weren't regarded as, as inferiors or something like that, but they were regarded as foreigners. And keep in mind, this is a very paranoid time when England is the sort of only holdout Protestant kingdom. Queen Elizabeth, as a Protestant, actually has essentially a fatwa. It has been declared that it would not be a sin if a Catholic were to assassinate her, because she was considered a heretic. So there were several attempts on her life. So any kind of foreigner is going to be a source of suspicion, and even people within her own court. She's going to have perfectly loyal courtiers like Sir Walter Raleigh, executed for treason based on suspicion that was pretty baseless. So there was a lot of paranoia going on at this time, and that always turns into xenophobia, but we shouldn't assume that that's the same sort of race relations that we're going to see later on. It's not necessarily any better, but it's not exactly the same thing. That means that Shakespeare's attitude toward actual North Africans or black sub-Saharan Africans is not easy to figure out. It's probably not as negative as Queen Elizabeth seems to have been. But it's also a white Englishman's reconstruction, or a white Englishman's notion about what an African is like. Also keep in mind that on the stage, Othello is originally played by Richard Burbage, or white man, who's, all of the King's Men, all of the Shakespeare's troupe are white. So we don't know if Richard Burbage played Othello in blackface or how he distinguished himself. We don't have any of those stage directions in the play. But we still recognize the fact that this is the construction of an idea of an African made by an Englishman or a group of Englishmen. The Shakespeare as the writer, but also Burbage and others as the performers. So this is a case study in the construction of the idea of race. But as far as how Shakespeare conceived of an African as a type, or race as types, are going to be less significant because, as I'm going to get to in the next lecture, types are going to come apart. We're going to be looking at individual minds that are shaped by individual circumstances. And rather than asking if Shakespeare got the type right, we're going to question the very idea of types of people. And that's going to be especially important when we examine the characters in the play, and how Iago in particular tries to create types as a method of deceiving people rather than as a method of actually understanding people.